even Hamas would not have predicted how successful the October 7th attacks would be, not just in terms of the amount of Jews they managed to kill, but in the response in the world, the positive response to the murder of Jews and the demand that Hamas be allowed to do what they promised and do it again and again. And the one exception to that was Israel. In Israel, right after October 7th, there was seemingly resolve that this can never happen again and that it needs to be prevented with military action. That resolve is slowly disappearing. And in recent days, we've seen protests in Israel on different topics, generally demanding Netanyahu resign from his job, something that, we on this channel have done some of us on this channel have done from pretty much right after October 7th. And yeah, but the bottom line is one of the main issues in these protests is a demand for a deal to release the hostages. And that demand is a demand of Israel to make that deal. Now, what does that mean? That means Israel has to, what is preventing Israel right now from making a deal? It is not what should prevent them, which is the moral clarity that you never negotiate with terrorists. It is the disagreement on how much we should give in to the terrorists. So the protesters are demanding that Israel give whatever Hamas is demanding in order to make this deal and release the hostages. So this is why, while I understand and sympathize with people in the chat who don't like this title, this is why I think these are very much protests in support of Hamas's position, at least at the very least, let's be generous, in the negotiation, which is of course why Hamas took hostages in the first place rather than kill as many people as they could. They made sure to take enough hostages that would then serve as human shields during the war and negotiating or bargaining chips to end the war in their favor, which is where it looks like we are currently going. Welcome to the Daily Objective. Day 178 of a war that should have been over in day 1 or 2. I'm joined by James Valliant. James, your thoughts on this?
Well, yeah, it certainly should have been completely wrapped up in October, eh? We shouldn't be still talking about it months on. We're 6 months out now, almost, right? In a week, it'll be 6 months away. And I have nothing but sympathy for the families of those who have had hostages taken by these animals. We have covered extensively the atrocities and the horrors of October 7th. We now have evidence that sexual abuse and torment is still continuing for those hostages. So I don't normally say this, but I have to say we have to ignore those families. I can understand their emotional pulls in both directions, but if they say whatever it takes to get the hostages back, how many more October 7ths would they be willing to pay? And I mean, I don't mean to sound cruel or cold or callous, but if you say whatever, then I have to ask you, so to get your loved one back, how many more October 7ths is that worth? Would you be willing to do? Because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about unrepentant, torturing, atrocity committing people here who have not lost a drop of their resolve, no matter how much is going on. They complain about the suffering in Gaza. Has that altered their resolve? No, of course not. That's the strategy of Hamas, is to cause their own people suffering. And as I understand the protests, overnight, we've had news stories in the United States all over the place about how tens of thousands of Israelis have taken to the streets in protest of Netanyahu and the government. But I understand it's a pretty mixed bag of things going on. For example, on Fox News this morning, they had an interview with the parents of one of the hostages, and they said, well, we don't demand Netanyahu go so long as he makes a deal that gets our son back. Well, I can understand that position, but that's not necessarily a ferociously anti-Netanyahu position, nor is it anti-Netanyahu in the way we would be at all. Yeah, Netanyahu, I have to admit, on the other side of you a little bit in the initial weeks after this, back in October, I was. I didn't think that was an appropriate time for me, especially for international people, to be telling Israel what to do or to criticize Israel's response. I was feeling a sense of unity at that point, and I wanted them. I wanted them to do something significant and severe in October. When that did not happen, I'm afraid any justification I have for being non-critical of Netanyahu is gone. So I am a critic of Netanyahu, but unlike at least some of these protesters, and you, like you, it's that Netanyahu has not done enough. That Netanyahu didn't preemptively stop this from happening in the first place, or that he was appeasing or doing hostage deals. And it is those very hostage deals, families of the hostages, that I would urge you to consider as the cause of what happened to your loved one. If it had not been for the fact that the Israeli government and the American government have been doing these insane hostage deals that encourages these terrorist monsters to do it, had there been a different policy, I would urge, I would beg, I would plead the families of the hostages, your loved one would not have been taken, killed, tortured, raped, had we had a clearer policy before this. So yes, it's Netanyahu. I have a question, though, of you. How much of this protesting has to do with the secular protests that pre-existed all this? Before October 7th, Israel was in sort of a political and constitutional crisis, maybe the biggest one in its history, between the secularists and the more religious types. And there's been a recent court decision in Israel, I understand, that requires even religious people to be subject to military conscription. How much of the protests do you think are that? How much of the protests do you think are about hostages? And how much do you think really, I mean, unwittingly, obviously, both are support, as you point out, unwittingly, whatever their motives are, I think at this stage, a lot of it is going to be perceived and reported abroad as in such a way that Hamas will once more be delighted. I think Hamas, as you point out, couldn't have imagined such a weak, pusillanimous response, the international response that they got. And they must be laughing, cheering. Nonetheless, I think it would be a mistake to characterize all of these protesters in a monolithic way. And I wonder if you can give us some insight as to the breakdowns on that.
Not really. I think to a large extent, maybe the number of people showing up is affected by the fact that yeah, people were protesting every Saturday and beyond that for many months in Israel. We talked a little bit on this channel about the judicial reform and the protests against it. I said I think both sides are terribly wrong. The judicial reform was a horrible idea, and the protesters were opposing it for the wrong reasons, for basically supporting the courts having unlimited power. So everything about it was just bad, and you know, it was said that Hamas maybe saw this as an opportunity. I think they probably planned it longer, but it could be that this was a part of the reason they did it when they did it, and the fact that the Israeli people were kind of united for a little bit after October 7th didn't really change much. I have to say, when it comes to the families of the hostages, I don't blame them at all. Like, I don't blame them for saying, I don't care how many more October 7ths there are. I just want my loved ones out of there. It doesn't matter. What matters is what the media does with it, and what, you know, how it's received. So the fact that the media highlights this, the fact that these are the headlines in Israel. Look, there's a protest. People are demanding a deal, without actually elaborating what a deal means, which, again, let's be very clear about it. A deal means you give the October 7th savages whatever they want, knowing that ultimately what they want is to kill every Jew in Israel. And if they can't do it in the next month or in the next year, you know, they're playing the long game. So what you're doing is giving in to that. And sorry, this is
Well, that's true. There's no question about it. The Hamas must be very happy that the press especially is spinning it that way and using the families of the hostages that way. Just the fact that there are mass demonstrations, though, in Israel should indicate the superiority of Israel. We've been talking. What do you think the safety zone is for a Palestinian, say, protesting Hamas or even the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank? Well, we can see we have a historical record what happens to protesters in the Islamic Republic of Iran. No, the fact that there is free speech, the fact that there is freedom of assembly. Now there is, they can't block roads. I don't think you have a right. Protesters anywhere, Israel, America, anywhere else, have a right to violate other people's rights in their protest. But nonetheless, just look at the difference between free speech in Israel and free speech in Iran, say, or free speech in any of the other surrounding countries. It really does show a radical difference with Israel. And as I say, I think that you're absolutely right. The hostage families, whatever comes out of their mouth, I think we have to understand. If it was my wife who'd been taken hostage, you restrain me from trying to stop to get to her would be the problem. So I do have sympathy for them. On the other hand, the media and the policymakers have to make clear that no, that it is those kind of hostage deals that led to October 7th. Any more such hostage deals will only guarantee more October 7th. And I don't know where that wisdom is, because it's nowhere to be heard in the media. It's nowhere to be heard among our policymakers.
Yeah.
Certainly
By the
not
way,
treacherous president that I have, who's now appeasing for domestic political purposes. He's stabbing Israel straight in the back.
so just a side issue. We've said in the past on this channel, we really appreciate the engagement from trolls who help with the algorithm, and so we'll allow them when they call us names, when they say deep things like free Palestine, or put a PLO flag, or say genocide, or whatever it is that these people are parroting. We don't allow flat out lies that I don't think even Hamas would promote. Daniel, if you can remove the Nazi propagandist from the chat and make sure he doesn't we don't see him again. Yeah, this one who just commented again. I'm not even going to read that one. Yeah, so there are different protests, and there was one in I believe Jerusalem a few days ago, there was one in Jerusalem I think yesterday, there was one a few days ago. And so some of them are full on like calling for a ceasefire, claiming that Israel is committing a genocide. Of course, the call for a ceasefire again is a very clear call in support of Hamas.
Oh,
It
yeah,
skirts the law, in terms of
right.
treason,
No, but that's
maybe.
nakedly pro-Hamas.
Yeah, because it is a statement. The fire must cease now that Hamas is unable to fight and do what it did on October 7th. It must cease so that they are allowed to regroup. That is exactly what a ceasefire means. And I do want to say, yeah, we agree that blocking the roads should never be allowed. That's not a legitimate form of protest. You have the right to express your views. You do not have the right to prevent me from getting from point A to point B because I have to listen to your views. That is not within the legitimate role of government to approve that. But we've said, and I will repeat, that there is one type of protest that is happening that isn't highlighted by the media, that is involved, that some families of hostages are involved in, which are the protests attempting to block the aid, the so-called humanitarian aid, which we have said on this channel, there is no such thing at a time of war. This is military aid, even if it's just food to make sure that the terrorists are strong enough to hold guns or RPGs so yeah, this is military aid, and there are attempts to block it. That is a very good type of
Yeah,
protest,
I
which
like that. There's something, I mean, that's the kind of protest I might join in on. I'm sorry, just conveying my emotional attitude there. If I was to join a protest here, it would be to block aid entering Gaza right now.
yeah.
Yeah,
And by the way, Michelle says in the chat, no hostages, no aid. This was the policy of Israel, the stated policy at the beginning. You release all the hostages if you want any aid. And there was that statement by to whoever it was in Israel to Egypt, if you send fuel into Gaza, if you send fuel trucks, we will bomb them. Israel rhetorically was on the right side of this war at the beginning, and now it has shifted fully to being apologetic about any attempt to prevent Hamas from doing what they want, and yet people in Israel are demanding more, basically more concessions towards the October 7th savages.
This is why it was important to do it back in October. Every day after October 7th that passed, it was going to get harder and harder. Resolve was going to weaken and weaken. The international situation was going to get worse and worse. And that is why. See, if this had all been wrapped up back in October, it would have been before anyone could file a charge with the International Court of Justice, before anyone could say, well, look how long it's taking, and look at all this suffering, and look at all this starvation in Gaza. No, they should have killed the Gazans right away. Just engaged in a mass killing of Gazans right away. And that way we could have at least had a chance of having some proper deterrence for the future, at least. But no, now it's we're so deep into it now. We're considering what rewards Hamas gets, what rewards Hamas will get for October 7th. How many more terrorists will be released as a result? How many terrorists get to survive? How much of Hamas's leadership in Rafah gets to escape? How much resupplying of Gaza can now continue? No, the fact that this at all wasn't completely wrapped up in October was a huge, huge mistake, because every day that passed after October 7th, the situation only got worse and worse and worse.
So Ideology says in the chat, I was filming in London on Saturday. My guess is there were 30,000 plus pro-Palestinians and about 120 on the pro-Israel, pro-Western civilization side. We need to show up. So we're going to talk about these protests later, but on the reality show. But like, do we need to show up? Are these protests changing policy, and if they or affecting policy, and if they are, does that mean that that is the way that we need to go? I think maybe they are, but it doesn't matter. If this is how you affect policy, then we are so far gone that
We're pretty screwed.
unfortunately, yeah, we are screwed.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we don't need to try whatever we can, but I don't think that's the way. And the sad thing is, I think those protests should not be allowed.
And the real thing is, I'm pretty confident that Israeli mentalities are going to have their own attitude. But look at what it's doing in domestic politics in the United Kingdom or domestic politics in the United States. The support from anyone who might even think of supporting Israel is completely crumbled. The resolve, and I see, like I mentioned earlier, my president has finally caved in to the domestic politics from his hard left and his need to win Michigan in the upcoming presidential election. And so he's completely stabbed Israel in the back. These protests do affect domestic policy in places like the United States and the United Kingdom, and that is very unfortunate.
Now, what's scary is not just the kind of the range of the moment thinking that goes into these protests. It's just and the lack of any principle thinking that goes into it. But it's the fact that, well, it goes into the range of the moment thinking. But if we look at the Gilad Shalit deal, and we know that many of these terrorists went back to do what they do, including the person who masterminded the October 7th attack. And we know this is going to happen with the future terrorists who are released. But we don't have to go that far back. We can go back a few months. And again, I've said I would not, release a single terrorist for all the hostages unless we can, booby trap him. But
Yeah.
but look a few months back, leaving that aside, look a few months back to when there was a hostage deal. That hostage deal, the terms of it were certainly not as bad as the terms now being accepted and offered by Israel and rejected by Hamas. Why is that? What was different then than what we're seeing now? What was different then was that Israel was on the offensive much more than it is now. We hear about this operation in Shifa Hospital that just ended. 2-week operation, going into buildings, into the building, killing some terrorists, arresting some terrorists. And I read in Israeli media that they say, well, this will help us in the next hostage deal. Why? Because you have terrorists that you can release. This is not, this is so upside down thinking.
It is immoral. It
Israel,
is
just
flatly immoral to
just a
think that
quick
way.
point about the if you know, we see images, we hear two things from the anti-Israel crowd in the media. We hear you know, Israel is attacking a hospital, and then we look at the images of North Gaza where many buildings have been destroyed, and both of those are kind of, if anything, the other way around. So those buildings in the north were bombed empty. People were told to leave, and
We're
then they were
warned, and
bombed
every
weeks later.
by text, by megaphone, they were warned to get out.
Weeks later. Now, if Israel wanted to target the places where terrorists are hiding, the first bomb of this war by Israel would have been dropped on Shifa Hospital. That is the
Exactly.
first place that should have been bombed. Yet, even now, it wasn't bombed. So Israel operated there, left, the terrorists regrouped, Israel went back in, soldiers died in this operation, and now Israel left. And whatever makes Shifa Hospital such a great place to uh, plan terrorism from is still there because you know it's building is still there and
First, first of all, it's immoral to have let one Israeli soldier die from this. First, let's start there. Secondly, it was immoral to be in effect acting like a useful idiot for Hamas in not attacking that hospital. C, by having attacked that hospital and shown the moral resolve that that would involve, we would have a much better chance of getting a handle on this. But no, that kind of appeasement is exactly playing into Hamas's hands and disgustingly costing the lives of Israeli defense soldiers. That is immoral on the face of it, Razi. That's an immoral way to fight any war. Full stop.
yeah, Victoria said earlier in the chat that we don't know if the hostages are alive or how many of them are alive. Now, there is no doubt that Hamas is making sure that some of them are alive. They might be killing some of them. Yeah, as you know, if you have an individual that you know who's there, you don't know whether or not they're alive. But yeah, you can rest assured that Hamas will make sure enough of them are alive. You know, some of the reports that you know make sense, whether or not this is correct, makes sense that that it would be, is that Sinwar himself, the number one target of Israel in Gaza, is surrounding himself with hostages wherever he goes
Right.
because
That's the reason why any of them are surviving. First, they're bargaining tools, but secondly, gosh, they make wonderful shields for our leaders, don't they? And if they're willing to engage in these deals for them, see, that's the immoral thing about deal making. You can't make deals with the people who want you wiped out and destroyed. You can't make deals with the people behind the Hamas charter that calls for the destruction of Israel. You can't make deals with people who engage in October 7th. Now, think about the hostage situation. We have some evidence that sexual torture is still going on, but consider what happened on October 7th. I'm going to say it again, and it's not pleasant to think about, but people were raped to death. Children were burnt and raped to death. There was sexual mutilation and torture. So imagine what's going on there and what has happened to those hostages, though even the ones who are still alive. I don't want to think about the kind of torment that they've undergone for the last 6 months. But that must be borne in mind. How many more October 7th do we want? And so preventing more October 7th should be the screaming priority, right? Anything that would cause that to happen again, anything that would encourage that, anything that would sanction that, appease that, is only going to cause more October 7th. Reward
yeah.
them for October 7th and then cause more.
Now, again, I don't think it's protests are the right way to do it, but if you think, you know, there there would be protests, what you would think what might be sensible demands of protesters would be for Israel to actually start fighting this war, not according to what its enemies want, which is the prevention of any casualties among the side that did October 7th and vows to repeat it. you would want a war that eliminates those people, that defeats them militarily, and that defeats them culturally, so that the culture can no longer exist. You would see demands. You would see demands for military operation in the West Bank. You know, there were two terrorist attacks yesterday in Israel. This isn't covered much, but there were two terrorist attacks because Israel is not operating militarily against these people. There were rockets from Gaza last week.
Rockets from Gaza, I
Rockets from
understand.
Gaza.
They've
So
recently been fired.
militarily, again, militarily, Israel had the capability to prevent this from happening again within hours or days at the most.
Surely,
And
Dave.
yeah,
The fact that it went weeks and weeks without a proper response. I mean, it took weeks to do anything. That is the outrage here. That is the outrage here. It truly is. It's the weakness of Israel's response. If you want me to have a protest, now I wouldn't block the streets or anything, but if I were going to engage in an anti-Netanyahu protest, I would say your reaction has been weak, appeasing, and is not 1/10 of what it should have been, and it should have been wrapped up back in October, Prime Minister. That's why I oppose you. Instead of this, make whatever deal possible, appease Hamas to whatever extent, appease the foreign opinion to whatever extent is necessary to get this done. No, that's only going to guarantee more October 7th. Promise. I'm not a magic prophet. I just know I'm just tired of year after year, decade after decade of appeasement resulting in exactly what I foresaw causing, and we see it again and again and again. Before 9/11, now this is more than 20 years ago in my country. Before 9/11, I was screaming that we were appeasing the Islamists, and of course, what happens in October? And then, of course, there's all this little violence between October, little violence, people getting slaughtered on the streets of Europe, people getting slaughtered in nightclubs in Florida, more Islamist violence. What do we do? Nothing. And now it manifests itself like this. And what do we have? Well, that means, Lord Cameron says, we have to reward them with a two-state solution. When a two-state solution is more absurd than ever, more absurd than ever. No, it is this very policy, and it is the reactions and the attitudes that we have that have absolutely doomed us from before we even start here. You're
yeah,
absolutely right. It's a question of
and
ideas.
and it's not a magical prophecy. You know, we've been saying on this channel from October 7th what will happen, and pretty much painted the picture as it turned out. It's not magic. It's understanding of ideas,
We're
of
meant to be
history.
Cassandra, though.
You know, one of the I will use this opportunity to sell some memberships and say that, you know, one of the perks you get as an ARC UK member at any level is you get access to the Sunday sessions on Leonard Peikoff's courses run by James Valliant. And now you're going through his course on the history of philosophy. Um, yeah, understanding how ideas work and how they shape history is important. And yeah,
Kant, we're covering Kant here, and it's too perfect. Kant said consequences in the real world have nothing to do with good and bad. Sometimes you just have to suck it up and suffer in order to be moral. It is that kind of ethical thinking that I'm afraid is paralyzing. You know, ethics has nothing to do with the real world. You know, it's that kind of that paralyzes Israelis, and much less Americans, but Israelis and Americans from taking the morally clear stance that they should have from the outset. It is exactly that kind of duty ethics that has nothing to do with the real world. It's that same kind of Christian altruism that is completely ideas shape history, ladies and gentlemen. And it's the ideas that have dominated in the West that have kind of screwed us into this position where we can't give a clear moral response, which is the only thing that has a chance of stopping these Islamist savages.
yeah, and we'll
I can't
talk
be
about
optimistic.
the Islamist savages and their representatives here in London and in the West on the reality show, which starts a minute after this show ends. Thank you, Ori, for the actually we had some more super chats, right? Who did I not thank earlier? Thank you, Bonnie. Thank you, Gail, and thank you, Ori. Ori says, thanks for the great content. People in my hometown in California organized a solidarity community event and are serving a traditional Palestinian cuisine. I've lost friends / made enemies because of this issue. So have I. I understand, and you know, in a way, this is a kind of disinfectant on a personal
Californians
level.
are detached from reality as about as far as any population in the civilized world is. So you know, yeah, it is an indicator of how bad we are in terms of our culture. Cutting edge California is cutting edge in the most worst, most immoral ideas you can find. Yeah. I come from California. I can verify that.
Did you go to any of those solidarity events?
Yeah.
Not
Well,
funny. All right.
yeah.
Not all jokes land, but I will come up with better ones for the reality show, which starts in a minute. Thanks, James. Thanks everybody for watching. We'll see you on the reality show.